and also please mute yourself, okay? But we will not record the question and answer session. So, hello again. My name is Soraya Batmangalic. I am the Associate Professor for the Study of Modern Iran here at the University of Oslo. And as the Chair of the Center for Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at this fine university, I would like to warmly welcome the social historian Rasmus Christian Elling, who is an Associate Professor at the Department for Cross-Cultural and Regional Studies, University of Copenhagen. There, he teaches Middle East studies as well as global urban studies, and he has researched modern Iran from 4 attention points, chiefly urbanism, ethnicity, political movements, and oil, and has written extensively on ethnic minorities, nationalism, regionalism, identity politics, urban social movements, urban violence, urban culture, student movements, university politics of the 1940s, 1970s, and 1990s, and also other periods as well. Rasmus is the author of Iran's Moderne Historia, which is published in Danish about Iranian history from the 19th to the 21st centuries, and it's based on Persian primary sources, and also Minorities in Iran, Ethnicity and Nationalism after Khomeini, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2013. So we warmly welcome you, Rasmus, virtually to the University of Oslo, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation entitled, this is a really wonderful title, In a Forest of Humans, the Urban, the Global, and Studying 1970s Revolutionary Socialism in Iran. So, without further ado, I present to you Dr. Elling.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction and for your kind invitation. I'm very honored to be part of such a splendid lineup you have for this semester. And I'm very happy to connect with Oslo. We're not that far away. Next time, hopefully, we can visit each other physically. So I'm going today to present some recent research of mine that was published recently in the book. You can see the cover of here on my slide. I hope you can all see my PowerPoint presentation. It's a wonderful edited volume, I dare say, edited by Professors Alimir Sepasi and Orhan Keshavarzian. It came out of a really wonderful project I was part of with a group of historians reconsidering this idea of 79 of the revolution in Iran, 1979, as a global event. And I start off basically by noting that historians, they generally tend to agree that the 79 revolution in Iran was an urban revolution. It was an urban moment in the political history of Iran, which is a fair narrative, I believe, because the revolution was overwhelmingly focused on Tehran and major cities. It was driven by urban classes, and if they even got into the action, the rural classes engaged very late in the revolution. And specifically, a key role was played by the urban guerrillas, socialist generally, socialist leaning and socialist urban guerrillas of the 1970s. So in order to deepen our understanding of the revolution, but also to ask global questions about the Iranian Revolution, I raised this issue, exactly what was urban about this quintessentially urban guerrilla movement of the 70s, namely a group that I today will mention as the Fadais, but their full name or the full organizational name was the سازمان چریک‌های فدایی خلق ایران. So the Fadais, I examine a broad range of materials from and about the Fadais, underground pamphlets, organization newsletters, intergroup debates, secret memorandums, theoretical writings, biographies and autobiographies. And I also benefit, by the way, from a sort of a wave of interest recently in the Fadais, in Persian and in English literatures. And I identify 4 analytical attention points connected to the urban, understood here as a range of social, material, and ideological phenomena connected to urbanization. So the first analytical attention point is basically the argument that Iran's rapid urbanization in the 60s and 70s facilitated the emergence of a phenomenon such as the Fadaris, not only in practical terms, but also that urbanization shaped their line of thinking. So leading cadres had generally very urban profiles. They hailed from major cities, and the material conditions and infrastructures that made underground political activism possible was very much associated with urbanization. So urban, big sprawling urban centers, universities, student dormitories, student movements, youth movements, street protests, street riots, underground printing presses, and safe houses, and all of the logistics that went into guerrilla warfare. And this is quite paradoxical because it stands in contrast with the heavily naturalistic aesthetics and mythology and cultural production associated with the Fadaris, namely the idea of the Siorkal resurrection, which is the name, the Rastokhize Siorkal, named after a little village in northern Iran, in a foresty, hilly area of northern Iran, where in 1971, the Fadaris actually launched the armed rebellion against the Shah by attacking a police station there. And after that event, and the whole mythology that grew out of the event, the Fadaris came to be associated with Ku, with the mountains, and with Jangal, with the forest, and with the Jangali communist rebels that preceded them half a century before. And they were even associated with the symbolism of flowers and animals. So it's quite interesting that despite this very non-urban or even anti-urban aesthetic, the urban was in fact a central feature of the historical context of the emergence of the Fadai and part of their mode of operation. That was the one exception where prior to the revolution, they actually engaged directly in armed struggle outside of a city. So secondly, I explore how urbanization, both in socioeconomic and cultural terms, was treated analytically by the Fadais in their prolific theory writing. I look especially at how they treated the effects of the so-called White Revolution, the top-down land reforms and other reforms issued by the Shah in the 60s, and how the Fadais saw that non-revolution, as it were, or fake revolution, top-down modernization, authoritarian revolution, as a catalyst for structural transformations from feudalism to dependent capitalism, repressive modernization, and industrialization under an aristocratic elite. And connected to that, very importantly in the Fadai analysis, a comprador bourgeoisies aligned with Western imperialism. So all of these structural changes and reforms led to breakneck rural to urban migration and the emergence of an urban sub-proletariat in the shanty towns that appeared around cities like Tehran. But there's also a particular focus in the Fadai writing that I found very interesting, and that's the idea of the urbanization of consciousness, that cities had urban cultures of protest in the middle of police state conditions. So the fact that urbanization became part of the explanation for the appearance of a revolutionary potential in an otherwise, in their view, very backwards place like Iran. And then the third analytical attention point that I look at is how the Fadais developed what we can call a guerrilla urbanology, or sharshenasi chariki. So this is a subversive epistemology where the urban becomes both a setting and a resource for armed revolutionary struggle. So in their underground pamphlets and manuals, the guerrillas were told how to map and study the urban landscape, learn about reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, safe house logistics, how to encode communication, evasion, shadowing, and other practical manners pertaining to urban space, on top of all the other issues and questions of organization and chain of command and morale and physical training and disguise and so on, all the stuff that was important to launch all of these small but significant armed attacks on police stations and hotels and so on. So I also argue broader that from this way of looking at the city was in fact an unspoken doctrine in Fadoi praxis, and I quote one of the leading theoreticians, Bijan Jazani, for calling the city a forest of humans, as a very evocative metaphor for the city, in which the Fadois sort of repurposed and re-envisioned urban space as a theater for armed propaganda, so propaganda of the deed, spectacular attacks that would undermine the state's image as unassailable and almighty and all-seeing. So these acts were then recorded in one way or another, distributed in pamphlets and publications with, for example, as you see on the screen here, hand-drawn maps and even hand-drawn scenes from the revolutionary deed itself, sort of depicting how urban space is being undermined by the revolutionary act. All of it to bolster this mythology of the urban guerrilla as a vanguard protagonist, moving through, undermining, destabilizing a hostile urban environment created by royal corruption and global capitalism and so on. And then fourth and finally, I look at a particular genre of Fadoi writing, or indeed revolutionary socialist activity that I find very interesting: the fieldwork reports put together by clandestine Fadoi cadres who went to the shanty towns of Tehran, the Halebiabad, as you call them, the tin cities, to locate and understand the urban sub-proletariat, the Hoshia Neshinon, or margin dwellers, as they're called in Persian, as a possible agent of revolutionary change. And this is interesting because up until then, and we're talking very late 70s, just before the revolution, they tended to search for that revolutionary protagonist in the factories, right? It was supposed to be the industrial proletariat, but now they turned their attention towards the shanty towns. So they went in and asked questions about everyday resistance against the authorities and their constant attempts to control and evict the slum dwellers. This was a struggle against state-led gentrification, authoritarian gentrification, that pointed towards a new leftist understanding of the right to the city, not just about the right to housing, but about the right to freedom, the right to shape the city and society and the nation. And the Fadais were flirting at this point with the idea that the sub-proletariat mobilizations were in fact revolutionary embryos of potential as big or even bigger, as I said, than the much romanticized factory workers. So to sum up, the Fadais, they saw the urban both as a scene for authoritarian repression, police state surveillance, and subjugation to a dominant bourgeois culture, entangled, as it were, in global capitalism and imperialism. And they also saw the city as the site of new forms of solidarity, resistance, and emancipatory potentials connected, and this is important, to a universal struggle for freedom and socialism. And this quote I pulled up on the screen here basically shows a very refined and interesting view about what is the role of armed struggle in urban space. It's basically to undermine, not necessarily to storm a city and take over power in its totality immediately, but to undermine authority in society by creating liberated zones. And I found this very, very interesting, an interesting notion. So I hope in the chapter I show how by adopting an urban analysis we can contribute with new historical knowledge of Iran in the 70s, and that this new knowledge should be placed within global history. Specifically, I try to show that the urban was used by the guerrillas to work through the global. That means the idea of thinking about and relating to the universalistic pretensions of Marxism and third world revolutionary theory, and thinking it through in a specific local context defined by rapid urbanization. So to think about, for example, the global forces of capitalism and imperialism as they manifested in everyday life in the city, and occasionally were met with resistance and urban struggle. And then they would use this analysis to point out a path toward an Iran-specific praxis, tactic, and strategy. So a locally relevant path for a particular national liberation struggle within a transnational space of revolution. Or put differently, the guerrillas used the urban to anchor theory in practice. And I think this is important because it can lead us to ask for nuance when it comes to existing intellectual or activist genealogies of revolutionary thought and action. And this is an argument I would like to push even further. So there is this tendency to see movements such as the Fadais in Iran as recipients of Western or global theories of revolutionary change, as if they were consumers of this trickle-down movement of revolutionary ideas. But what we see here is something different, I argue, that when the Fadais used urban, and I will also return to rural facts to debate and position the Iranian struggle vis-a-vis other Marxist and Third Worldist revolutionary experiences, be they Russian, Chinese, Cuban, Algerian, Palestinian, and South American. In this process, they generated their own analyses and theses based on local historical reality. So they were not just recipients of blueprints that came from the outside. They definitely wrote their own blueprints as well. It's an open question whether or not those were actually the blueprints that were then followed by the Iranian Revolution. But it's often presented as if it was after reading inspirational texts about experiences from abroad, especially the Brazilian theoretician Carlos Marighella and his work on the urban guerrilla, that it was only then that the Fadais then proceeded to dismiss earlier ideas about revolution, namely the Cuban blueprint for a revolution through local so-called Foucault-style guerrilla uprisings in the rural hinterland that would then encircle the city and take over the country. And they dismissed this blueprint as befitting for the case of Iran. But actually, I can see that they did that already before they had read possibly Marighella. So in '69, the same year that Marighella wrote his classical mini manual of urban guerrilla, some of the same thoughts were already being pushed by people like Ali Akbar Safai Farahani from the Fadais. So we should be careful about these intellectual chronologies. We're told how revolutionary ideas move around in the world. And this makes me think more broad about the idea of a global urban revolution, and specifically one particular essay by sociologist Stuart Schrader on the website for the Global Urban History Project really made me think a lot. He traces the intellectual genealogy of a key term in the famous French philosopher Henri Lefebvre's work on urban politics and the production of space. And he argues that when Lefebvre wrote about La Ville Mondiale, the global city, he actually did that with reference to a third worldist conception of the global urban that Lefebvre had come across reading a Maoist statement from '65. So the Maoist proposition was that cities around the global south were encircled by rural hinterlands teeming with revolutionary spirit, and that the key to the city, so to speak, was in the countryside. And that it was from the countryside that the forces of revolution would soon crush the urbanized and urbanizing spaces of capital. But this prompted Lefebvre to think about the opposite, that urbanization and urbanism had actually surpassed and overflown the conceptual confines of the city, erasing the urban-rural divide as classically thought out, and heralding a new phase, a new historical phase, in which the right to the city would become, as he famously wrote, a cry and demand around the world, around a planet covered with urban landscapes. And with this conceptual history, Stuart Schrader invites us to challenge prevalent Eurocentric views and instead broaden our understanding of the globalized and urbanized condition of late capitalism. And I try to show in my work that by the time Lefebvre's La Révolution urbaine hit the streets of Paris, there were key revolutionary thinkers in Iran who had already decided that the urban was spilling into the rural. that the cities were turning into forests of humans, and that urban guerrilla warfare was the only feasible way, rather than rural guerrilla campaigns such as in China and Cuba. So global urban history is a sprawling field of research that requires a systematic analytical attention to the urban, and as a connection between different scales and spaces. In other words, we should consider global urban history, I think, above all, as a method. It's a way, it's an approach with which we tease out details about the patterns that structured myriad small and big acts, the lived and embodied experiences of aspirations and actions, with the simple recognition that space is historical. A global urban historian will pay attention to the built environments in which thoughts were thought and actions were carried out, the way cities and urbanizing landscapes and infrastructures have impacted humans, ideologies, cultures, and politics. This doesn't mean that we're interested in overstating global urbanization as like an all-round causal explanation. Rather, we're interested in a complementary frame of analysis that can possibly also challenge existing frames that might, for example, boil something as complex as the Iranian Revolution down to a purely national or cultural or religious or ideological phenomenon, insular, exotic, exceptional. I think global urban history is one of several frameworks we can apply to gain eye-opening reminders of the connectedness of change around the world, and also the synchronicity, and prevent us from being blinded by the exoticism of local particularity or by event fetishism inherent in talking about the global 79 or the global 68 and so on. So I hope that a global urban history of Iran's 79 revolution could add this crucial dimension, perhaps specifically not just spatial, but also temporal dimension of synchronicity or simultaneity. So perhaps those are equally important as other ideas that tend to dominate the field right now. So the idea of diffusion, the idea of transfer history, the idea of mobility, the idea of traveling theory, and so on. Global entanglement, in other words, need not just spatial, but also temporal dimensions to make full sense. However, at the same time, while micro-histories of change in individuals or groups and societies at the local scale can attune us to phenomena clearly conditioned by uneven global developments and the planetary transformation and structures that we collectively call urbanization, we should also recognize that these challenges are never reducible to their structural conditions. So in other words, we need to understand the Iranian case on its own terms and in its own words, and this is something I will return to if we have time, and with its own concepts. So this was a very brief, like very quick overview of that research. What next, you may ask? Funnily enough, I have prepared a slide for that. Right now, I am working on a new project together with my dear colleague Sune Haugbølle at Roskilde University. We have termed it, interestingly enough, we launched it as 1979 and the end of Third Worldism in the Middle East. We've now changed it to the fate of Third Worldism in the Middle East because, no surprise, some of the research already generated by this, we have a whole lot of really interesting scholars around the world preparing papers. They have already presented it at one conference, and we're going to put some of it together in an edited volume. And we can already now agree that it's too early to say that Third Worldism is dead in the Middle East. But there is this overall sense that 79 was a breaking point. A lot of things happened. The Iranian Revolution, you know, the beginning of armed Islamist insurgency with the occupation of the holy areas of Mecca, and the beginning of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and around the same time, the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganism. And there is this idea that the global 79 is to be seen as a breaking point. And I'm it's way too early to say if I agree or disagree with that thesis, but what we have already found out is that there is much more work to be done on the idea of third worldism and third world imaginaries of third world, and especially I think interesting third world practices. So how did revolutionaries travel to each other and learn from each other's experiences in training camps, and when did they not travel, and where did they not go? So the idea that borders also become more solidified and difficult to traverse in this time of Middle Eastern history specifically, but also all the global connections between the struggles in the Middle East, the different national liberation movements. We're focusing particularly on Iran and Palestine in this project, but you could include many other movements and how they connect to, say, the Cuban movements, the Angolan movements, movements in Southeast Asia, and so on. So my part in this project so far has been, of course, the overall. I'm discussing some of these overall issues with the SUNE and all the participants, but I also have my own sub-project together with a colleague in Iran, where we're trying to look at the subnational and rural scales of revolutionary socialism in Iran. So my first book, as I think Dr. Batman Galic mentioned in the beginning, was about ethnic minorities and nationalism in post-revolutionary Iran. And I would like to return to some of these issues, but from a different historical angle. I'm interested specifically in how did the Fadais and similar groups view the national question when it came to ethnic minorities in Iran and their aspirations for autonomy. I think this is a hugely important and quite understudied chapter, not only of Fadai history, but of Iranian history. So what happened after the revolution was the Fadais, who had basically helped create the revolution and spearheaded the revolution, then they fell out with Khomeini, alongside many of the Kurdish leftist militant organizations. And very soon there was fighting both in Kurdistan in western Iran and in Turkmen Sahara in northeastern Iran, that some of the Fadais actually joined. They went there and fought against the Khomeini militias. And it's super interesting for me to ask, so if we focus first on Iran as a national liberation struggle, as the Fadais saw it, then what is the impact on the Fadais as individuals and as theoreticians of understanding the Kurdish struggle also as a national liberation struggle? And how does all of that fit into the Third Worldist narrative? So that's something I'm working on right now. And it could be part of a broader question. I hope other people are also working on this. The question of rural peripheries and in general peripheries and peripheralized peoples within this national liberation struggle in the 70s and beyond. So there's something very interesting going on here about what happens when revolutionary socialists, with their strongest intellectual and ideological basis in the big Persian-speaking cities, come to understand the country as a place with several margins or peripheries, and with the rural hinterland that they probably knew very little of, many of them, until they had to go there and become mountain guerrillas, almost as prophesied in the original aesthetics of the Fadai as a Jangali, as somebody fighting in the forest and in the mountains. So this shifting between urban and peripheral focuses, just as the Fadais moved from the mountains and forests to the city and back to the mountains and into the plains after the Khomeini's power consolidation, I hope eventually, sometime down the road, to contribute to new research by raising questions about the relationship between Third Worldist and revolutionary socialist activism, solidarity, ideology, and theory on a global scale, and the national liberation struggle on a local particular scale. I hope and believe that this can strengthen our understanding of Iran and Iranian history, and hopefully also push us to think about other narratives within which to place our historical interpretation of modern Iran. The co-production of these different scales, I think, is key. I don't know, I try to draw it, right? As a typical, when people in the humanities try to do do like a diagram here. But I hope it shows, it visualizes the idea that there's something very interesting going on between these different scales. We have people who are moving both between different national liberation struggles in the region, taking inspiration and hopefully sometimes also inspiring national liberation struggles elsewhere in the world, while at the same time focusing very much on an urbanized country where power is very much urbanized and urban centered, and then also realizing that there are so many other struggles going on, struggles that continue today, is important to acknowledge, particularly the struggle of ethnic minorities in Iran. And hopefully this can lead to a more nuanced understanding of Iranian history, of social and political and militant movements of the 70s. So I leave you here with a painting by the Marxist revolutionary theoretician Bijan Jazani, and open to questions, I guess.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rasmus, for this. I'm very happy that you spoke. And also, I can't wait for your work, your next work coming out, because I had a question sort of related to that, but you already sort of